Hi everyone, Brandon Green here. I specialize in biomechanics for drummers. You might know me as Drum Mechanics. Today I'm interviewing Bruce Becker. Bruce is a 40-year veteran in the drum education space. He has a ton of knowledge and wisdom around technique, flow, and a lot of passion when it just comes to being a healthy drummer. Bruce is someone who takes care of his body. He's very strong and fit for his age and does an incredible job. He has taught Glenn Sobel, Mark Schulman, David Garibaldi, and he studied with Freddie Gruber, which is just absolutely brilliant. He's taken Freddie Gruber's education and continues to share it forward through the generations of drummers. We're going to jump into the interview, but before we do, if you're someone who's committed to staying strong and healthy, I have the Drum Forever Fitness program, both gym and home workout programs to help you stay strong so you can drum forever and never succumb to injuries. If you're interested in checking it out, click the link below for 7 days for free, but let's jump into Bruce's incredible interview. Bruce Becker, welcome to the Drum Mechanics podcast. Man, I'm very excited to talk to you. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. I appreciate it. I'm
Honestly,
looking forward to a robust conversation.
Yeah, well, looking into your background, even just talking to you for a minute before we signed on just to press record, you have a vast background. You worked with incredible students. You've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of experience. So I'm really excited to dive into technique and really just learn a little bit more from your years of experience.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it depends on what angles you want to take, but my whole approach is more of a expanded range of motion with what you can do technique-wise. There's a lot of people talking about what French grip is or what German grip is or American. I may have a little bit of a subtlety of my own nomenclature to describe what's going on. And that being said, there are principles that I was exposed to when I was a young guy. For example, for the French grip, I was a student back at Cal State Northridge. And the problem with that is they didn't have a jazz studies program. So, I was a drum set guy, and you had to go in and be a classical guy and learn mallets and timpani and all that stuff. And if you wanted to have a reasonable look at to see if you were capable of playing in the jazz band. So, if you went in and you weren't a major, I don't think you'd get any eyeball on you at all. Nobody would really give you the time of day necessarily, as I recall. Now, that could have been different. I might have missed somebody, but everybody I saw was in the department. So I joined the department and studied feverishly. And I had this great lady, Karen Irvin, who was a little, maybe about a 4'10" or 4'11" dynamo, and she was pretty intimidating. And when I went to the second semester with her, she said, "All right, let's work on some timpani etudes. I teach French timpanist grip. I hope that's okay with you." And I was like, "Yes, ma'am. I don't know what you're talking about." So there was a whole relationship of, how you bounce the mallet off the timpani head, and, you don't play real fast rolls. And in order to do that successfully, rather than clamping down and holding the mallet, and of course this is not a mallet, but the stick, you're basically choking what's going on resonant-wise. And so the fingers are meant to be more open and stabilizing effects to the mallet so you can bounce. And now you're getting into a sphere of, she didn't actually impart the next, the next portions of what I will talk about. But now you're talking about physics when you're bouncing with a stick. If I put a rubber ball on that mallet or the stick and I hit the surface, I want to be able to respond and bounce with it as if it were a rubber ball and not pound, or as I say, clamor or hammer. I want to bounce with it. And so in this position, and depending upon what tempo I am, moving, I can allow my forearm to be interjected into the response to the bouncing stick. And that's what I would call really building upon a fluid approach to what you're doing. So there are initial exercises that we would do to kind of change the reflexes of what we do and build upon an understanding of the balance and the pressure points that we use in our hand. It's not a one, just grab that stick and hold it. You want the hand to be able to breathe and move effectively. And you, as in your profession, would probably know this because you're working in a therapeutical fashion of getting people to move back to where they were originally. If you let your wrist drop and loose, and it's funny, not everybody has that kind of a loose wrist. They have a lot of tension built in. But if you drop, your fingers just naturally draw open based on the tendons. The ropes just kind of open up. If you pull back, they draw in. So knowing that that's a natural feature of our anatomy, let's use it. Use it naturally. Let them open and close. And I'm not saying it's just that cut and dry because there's a little bit more to it. But understanding how those natural principles work and getting into an understanding of the balance of the stick and, how gravity works. I mean, it's pretty easy. You drop something and it falls. But, you want to be able to also respond to the slightest amount of energy that you produce. You can redirect that energy and redistribute it in a very efficient, flowing fashion. So in that French grip, there's a couple of things that I would put forward. You can get into, the bounce, where at a slower rate of speed, my forearm would be drawn in to support the bounce. My fingers on the back end of the stick are slightly, bringing some pressure to stabilize that stick so it's not loosey-goosey and flipping around. I wouldn't want to necessarily just do fingers at this slower tempo. And that's not really even fingers what I'm doing there. My radius ulna bones are being responsive to the bounce of the stick. And then you get into fingers. So those would be your primary gears. You would have, an open bounce that you could draw your forearm into. You have the rotation of the forearm, the radius ulna bones being drawn into responding to the bouncing stick. And you have fingers. And then, of course, there's the molar method. You could play molar, a locomotive action, whereby I'm not using my fingers. I've demonstrated that numerous times, but the fingers are, moving with the stick. They are becoming now highly sensitized shock absorbers to the motion of the stick. If I really push fast in French grip, the fingers will start to overtake and deliver more of that push. And so what is the whole takeaway from that? A couple things. I want to be able to have access to the understanding of that. So when I go over to my floor tom, which would be the most natural position to be in rather than doing this, I want to understand how those principles operate. And on this flappier floor tom, be able to deliver the response to a flappier head. Energy sent and energy redirected and redistributed in an efficient way. You'll get what you need out of this. I've had people go like, well, that looks cool, but how do you do that on a floor tom? And I'll say, very easily, thank you very much. But along with that and positioning and maybe playing the ride cymbal like that, you've got dialectical nuance. If you listen to any old school R&B pattern in that medium tempo, I always use the tune by the Jackson 5, I Want You Back. That's, oh, baby, give me one more chance to get it. Those are open bounce eighth notes. It's not cut and divide like this. So let's step back and just say, what's the difference? Well, there is a big difference. You have that cut and divide kind of lope, it changes the feel. And I want to have all those little subtle nuances. If you look at music and your role as a drummer supporting that stuff, you are a character actor, or you are somebody who's bringing nuance to dialect, right? If we think about, I lived in Belgium for a number of years, in Austria, I traveled to Germany a billion times, and all over a lot of different spots of, the Netherlands and Denmark and Italy and blah, blah, blah. They all have like different dialects. It could be like 30 kilometers away. I'm in Antwerp, Belgium, and then I'm watching a program like one of those like news programs, and they're interviewing like a farmer of a village that's 30, 40 kilometers away. They're running subtitles. I asked my ex-wife, I go, why are they running subtitles? Don't you understand this guy? And she looked at me, no, I can't understand a word he's saying because it's a dialect. So if we think about, music, all the contributors, there's different dialects. If you think about Purdy in the R&B version, or what I want to say, his contributions to R&B, James Gadsden, Clyde Stubblefield, and on and on and on. While they're kind of doing some of the same things, there's a dialectical nuance that's recognizable within each contributor. And the same thing would, go to jazz, rock, name it. You're going to have those subtle nuances. So what I try to do is facilitate the freedom of movement so that you can get into your head and your ears and your heart. Make it easy. Because if your body is resistant to moving effectively, you're just going to be in your head like moaning and groaning, going like, ugh, I wish I could get these 16th notes out. I can't, I'm not going to make it. That's the last thing I want to see. So I've been very blessed. Like a lot of my students, Brandon, they're in their 50s and 60s, and they're making significant changes. So I always say, like, lest you believe that you can, teach the old dog new tricks, and you don't believe that, it's far from the truth. I have a lot of guys that will be my witness to that, hundreds over the years. I've been teaching for 44 years, man. Can you believe that?
No,
and I'm only 44. No. So, but I had good mentorship. I spent a lot of time with Freddie, the cryptic magician, because Freddie Gruber was gifted in observation. And, he did get the points across, but it took, a fine-toothed reading of the Freddie Gruber manual of understanding what he was talking about. I had the luxury of hanging with him for a number of years after studying with him, where I could get deeper with him in conversation. And still, maybe it was slightly cryptic, but I could pull out more of the nuances. I got to know him. I hung with him for roughly 23 or 24 years.
It's incredible.
So it was a pretty, close-knit relationship there. And then I got to know Jimmy Chapin really well too, who had, his themes and theories of the Moeller method and all that stuff. And basically what I would say is, taking all that stuff and pushing forward, you learn, you learn to problem solve better when you're in the trenches of teaching and also playing or recording. Like those are the trinity of what I've done my whole life. I've done, thousands of gigs. I'd have to sit and look back at my calendar books, but thousands of gigs. And maybe, to honestly, only maybe a couple hundred or maybe 280 sessions. I don't know, not thousands, but enough when I was digging in to know, that's not working. What do I do to get this to come across better? What am I doing mechanically that is inhibiting me? Or what can I do mechanically to push me forward and get a better approach to what I'm doing musically? Because, it's all feel. When it lasts on a tape in the old days, now it's digital, but on tape, you listen back and you want it to be like slamming. You want it to, 30 years later, look back and go like, yeah, okay, maybe the synth sounds were a little clownish because it was, 1987, but you go, man, the feel was there. That was pretty cool. So anyway, those are the things I expand upon. So let me let you ask a question because I'm done.
I got something. So you mentioned something a few minutes ago where you're talking about just throwing the hand down, and that some people don't have that reflex, and you want to try to use the stick as much as you can and kind of leverage that physics as much as possible. So I kind of have a two-part question for you. My friend Jacques is a neuroscience expert. He was on the podcast. It was a lot of fun. But he talked about how if you do things enough time, it does become a reflex as far as how your body sees it. So it's an autonomous motion. So there's kind of two ends to this question. There's the one is, if you have someone who's brand new and they've never, ever, ever picked up a drumstick, and or they've picked up a few sticks, but they just have not spent any time on technique, how do you start walking them through developing the reflex of having that control? And then on the other end, the bad habit continuum, right? You've got someone who's a 30, 40, 50-year-old veteran of drumming. They've got, they're fast, but they're muscling it out and really, really tense, and they've ingrained tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours of bad technique in. How do you unwind that?
Easy. First and foremost, let's go to the beginner. I don't really teach beginners, and if they do come to me, they kind of know what they're in for. And if I was doing that, I wouldn't directly go technique with them because I don't want to lose their enthusiasm for the instrument. So at that point, for all the educators out there, and some people know, and maybe some people are just kind of in the education mode as a way to collect some dough, and they think, I'm very passionate about education. I'm very passionate about my role as a teacher or as a mentor or as a coach. Let's put it more like a coach. That you are there to supply a plan of action, a curriculum, if you will, which is what I have. So with a beginner, I wouldn't go too deep in the technique. I don't want to lose it. But as you go through the process and they're getting into a cool song that they like, and they're suddenly challenged. Like I had a lady who had never played drums. She started with me when she was 40. She got involved in this by my urging her to do this, joined a band workshop where they would rehearse once a week. And at the end of 10 weeks, they would perform. And they were doing, maybe Pride and Joy by Stevie Ray Vaughan. Well, that's not easy to play a shuffle. So she's like, well, what do I do? I go, well, okay. So what we want to work on is like the mechanics to get you there. But you're going to have to do what you can only do when you're performing. You can't worry about, well, am I doing this right? You just have to get in and try to draw upon the best musicianship that you have to offer to make it swing, to make it sing. So you start to ease into those things and carry them forward once they get the faced with the daunting task of like, I can't do that. Yeah, I know you can't. So let's do these things so you can. Now to your question about how do you change and reframe reflexes? Hey man, the way I do it is there's like specific little hand exercises that I would do that draw upon a new identity, what's going on. And so as soon as you start to realize the tension and the release value, you're all of a sudden going to start to operate more about that, no matter what your reflexes are. I've had many people who will say like, well, should I stop practicing what I'm doing? And my line is no. Now, in the old days, I would have said, well, yeah, maybe you should watch what you're doing. Now I know, don't. Keep doing what you're doing. My stuff will permeate and shift and change. And like I said, I have hundreds and hundreds of guys and gals that have studied with me that have made significant changes and are impressed with where they've gone in their playing in their late 50s or 60s, and seeing that, oh my God, I feel much looser. I'm getting a better tone out of the drum. I can swing. That's not necessarily going to bring them to the perfection mode, because honestly, the path of what we do is a continuous path. There's no quick fix. There's no instant potatoes. Freddie Gruber used to always say that to me. And they taste like crap too, you know. They don't, taste like paste. So if you're going to really engineer the result, you're in it to win it, and you continue the walk. Like in terms of like being in shape or doing those kinds of things for your health. If you want to change your eating habits, you don't wake up one morning and just start eating fruit and yogurt, because you're going to reflexively, somewhere deep in the dark recesses of your brain, you're going to grab those Pop-Tarts, or you're going to, oh, whatever, I can have one bowl of, Cocoa Puffs. No, you got to change. So it takes some months to redesign what you do. And the same thing would apply here. But when you're physically active and doing my exercises and applying yourself in a regulated fashion, you will, and I can tell you countless guys and gals within a few lessons or 2 lessons, wow, man, the stick feels different in my hand. I go, yeah, because now you're feeling the weight of the stick. You're feeling the pliability of what that has to offer. Now it's a living and breathing entity. And we want to build that into how you direct that. Now, I want to be loose, but I also want to have a certain amount of impact and density. And so when you come to like a conga drum, when you do a slap tone, your hand's loose. You don't come in tight and hit the drum like that. You'll break your fingers. You're loose and you cup and you grab and you get a slap tone. Or if you're coming to an open tone, your fingers are drawn together and you're getting that nice open tone. A dead tone, you're letting your weight fall, right? Same thing applies in theory to drumming, right? First and foremost, you'd never hit a conga drum with blunt force with your hand. You'll break your fingers. So why would you take a stick and do that? You're going to take in all the shock and absorb that all into your bones and your tendons, and you're going to destroy your body. It's not going to be a healthy result. At the end of the day, that will win out. I always say youthful exuberance can carry you only so far, and then the stark reality of age and repetitive motion starts to draw forward. And if you're not mindful of that and really drawing into how those things work, you're not going to benefit at the end of the day. And I can tell you, I won't name names, but I've got guys who come in and they have their grievances. They're not going to air them publicly. The last thing you do. I'm kind of like the doctor, but I'm not a doctor. I don't want to profess to have any magic, but I do have solid insights as to how things can move, and I can demonstrate how that works. Okay, in terms of like the musicianship, that's a factor of what you have to build in terms of what you're passionate about musically. If you're into rock, great, own it. But don't just sit in that one small mode of rock. Expand your range of musicianship and musicality just to bolster what you do in your world, right? I was always telling any guy that was just sort of a jazz guy, well, look, man, you got to kind of work a little bit on your rock playing because it'll help your jazz playing. And any rock player would go like, you want to have a little jazz swing value to what's going on because it's going to help your rock playing. I mean, if you listen to the early rock guys like a Bonham, Ian Pace, a Mitch Mitchell, or Ginger Baker, they're all jazz influenced guys. Right. So that's what made them so special in what they did. And at the touch of a finger, you have every guy on this little device, right? You can look up any dude at any point in time and go, whoa, wow, amazing. And so, in this time of the age of information, we also have to kind of add to that the age of disinformation as well, because there's a lot of nonsense out there, but you have a lot of just easy stuff at your disposal. Like when I was a kid, you had to go to the club and watch the guy play. You had to listen to the record. And you couldn't just put pause. You took the needle off and you put it back on that lick or that tune again so you could listen to it in multiplicity. Yeah. Okay, cassette tape made a little easier because you could fast forward and rewind a little easier, but it was still a different process in terms of technology as opposed to what we have at our fingertips these days.
You touched on a good point there. You know, there's this thing that, there's a book I read, they called it activity-dependent aging, where every decade you start to get a little bit older and, you know, you're in your 20s and your 30s, you can muscle through pretty much anything and your body can recover at a pretty incredible level. But without the appropriate strength conditioning and techniques, all of it, you know, right forces, all that, as you know, medial lateral condylitis, carpal tunnel, all that stuff starts to pop up and becomes prevailing as a drummer, musician ages. So it's a real shame because usually most young drummers don't experience it until it's almost a little bit too late, but then they have a chance to talk to someone like yourself to kind of unwind that. In your opinion, with technique, what is a non-negotiable that people have to consider? If they're exploring technique, trying to make their hands, feet, whatever part is, what are non-negotiables to you?
Understanding how your anatomy naturally works, that's one thing. That's just how it works. Okay, you have resistance and you have reflexes that you've built in to express yourself. But if I lift this arm, this hinge should just naturally bend. If I have muscular resistance to that and it's not bending easily, there's a problem. And I don't want to have that problem. There's also a thing that I put forward in terms of the development of things that I always say, it's counterintuitive for drummers to let go. I'm here to send the good message that you can let go and you will get the response of what you need out of letting go and just falling in. There are certain thresholds we want to drop to. In other words, your floor tom's going to be a little lower and you meet that impact with a threshold. Then that elbow locks up, right? It's not going to fall below because that's going to not produce the tonal quality. It's going to be sloppy. The stick's going to fall out of my hand or whatever. But we want to be able to feel that letting go. But most importantly, to come down, we have to come up smoothly. So in order to really feel and ease, this hinge better be responsive, or this shoulder better be responsive to certain things, or my wrist. And along with that, it would be, the weight value of the stick. If I'm not able to discern like the difference between my hand weight and the stick weight when I'm holding the stick, and let's say I'm not clawing it or like, white knuckling it, I'm just holding it kind of closed in my hand. The stick has no room to breathe inside my hand. I can't tell whether that's my hand or the stick, and probably more my hand, but I also want to get into the weight value of my stick so that I can move effectively with it and just kind of push it along. Again, when you start to loosen up like that, you start to feel like, oh, I'll give you the line that I would often kind of do wordplay with Freddie Gruber back in the day. We were both really into the philosopher Alan Watts, who was this guy who was probably the most notable philosopher in the 60s and early 70s, who was gifted a great gift by being able to do his radio broadcasts on a Pacifica radio station up in Berkeley, California. And all his tapes were archived, all his radio broadcasts, as well as his live, workshops or whatever, when he'd be talking to people. He was like, like the Charlie Parker of philosophy. He was able to bring the Zen to a Western mentality of understanding. And so we do a lot of wordplay. And the line was, what's the difference if you don't know the difference? Right? If you're sitting in a sort of a stubborn, resistant place, you're never going to be able to experience what the true difference is and to be operating in a more efficient way. So my role and my goal is to bring that in terms of what I deliver in terms of technical abilities, conceptual abilities, etc. And then you're in a position to maybe you have 2 ways to do it, maybe 3, but at least 2, man. If you're talking about a difference in dialect, I could play in a French grip molar and play my 16th notes like that. I can play in a German grip molar. Difference tonally, because on the German side, I can hit the shoulder of the stick. Here, it's not really, I can make it work in a seesaw fashion here. But if I'm really working it, I want to usually get for tonal quality a consideration of the shoulder of the stick landing on the top hi-hat on the 1 and 2 and the E's and U's would be to the tip. And really what it is there's a collapse of the weight of the stick on the E and the So it's not a down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. It looks like that, but it's a strike and a collapse. And the upstroke is really provided by my forearm lifting, so the weight of the stick can draw my wrist into a release. And what does that mean? I don't want to over-release. If I let that wrist get drawn into a full level release, it destabilizes the momentum of what I'm doing. It also will change the tonality, and it'll just be a crumbly mess. So when I talk about a letting go and a release value, in theory, if I'm looking at some of my, what I would call the design of a release and a visual, somewhat cooperative element that you can watch for, the stick shouldn't really drop much below about a 30-degree angle. So if that's 0 degrees, that's about 30 in French. Same thing in German, same thing in traditional grip. When I come up, I want to have a good follow-through and feel that nice follow-through. Okay, so I got a little sidetracked, but when I'm going back to my strike, collapse, I'm dropping right to the sweet spot of the stick tip as well. So that 30 degrees provides for that. That's kind of like the threshold where you go, oh, that's where I want to be. So I meet the sweet spot of the stick tip. If I do and drop over the tip of the tip, hey, maybe I want that for some kind of musical expression. But if I'm only relegated to be able to do that reflexively, that's not a choice. You're kind of boxed into what you do. So again, I want to provide choices and clarity of how things can move. And then, of course, the calisthenics and the stickings are things that provide the repetitive motion to feel and own it. Okay, but they're not the only way, because you can go like, well, yeah, just play your paradiddles. Yeah, but if I don't have a how-to and design everything to reshape my hand so it's reflexively got an acoustic resonant chamber. I'm sure people see people and they're all closed down here and they're all kind of tight and they might be able to pull off paradiddles nicely, but the design is somewhat corrupted. I wouldn't look at that and go like, oh, that looks great. I go like, oh my gosh, that needs some polishing. And so with the hand shape and the design of that, we can construct a better range of how things move, getting into the back of the hand. I won't name names, but there's, former philosophies of teaching where the ring and pinky finger are just there. They're not really on the stick. I want the totality of my hand. I want all 5 digits to be drawn in to moving that stick so that I am now in a full range of operating. I don't want to fire on only 4 cylinders or 3. I want all 5 of these guys to be in there and figure out what their roles are. How do they move? Because, the middle finger can be your primary pivot point, but it could also be off the stick. I could play molar without my middle finger and sit comfortably balanced on my ring and pinky finger and get that stick to move along nice and easy and still get the mojo of what I'm looking for. The impact and the density and the flow. I'll just say that's not a trick necessarily, but I can just demonstrate that I don't need the middle finger. It can rest passively underneath the stick. It doesn't need to be engaged. And when you're talking about developing your fingers and holding that stick in German, the middle finger is going to be more dominant because it's a stronger finger. But in trying to develop a better role of how the ring and pinky finger play into that, we want to design some exercises where they are met with the task of doing what we ultimately want, being nicely balanced on the fingerprints, having that stick sit on the outer corner of the palm, not directly centered. If I'm centered in what we could just say, if I draw this half of my palm towards the base of my thumb and we get that little crevice, I could sit with that stick in the center? No, because the butt end of the stick's going to be bumping into my wrist. If I'm just slightly off center like this, all is well in terms of the relaxed posture of my fingers, and I'm not going to bump into anything. I'm right off that wrist bone right there. And you could go, well, yeah, but what if I go out here? Yeah, your fingers will be rendered into a less productive and useful position. That is not useful. However, I would say posture and gesture is all right for musical expression. You can get away from the pretty and perfect technique, provided you really understand the rules. What do they say? Know all the rules before you can break them. You know the rules, you can break them because you're going to come back and center yourself to what you know. What's the difference if you don't know the difference factor?
So I want to come back to that point because you kind of said that quote, which I thought was a really great quote. And this might be a slight segue, and then I want to come back to technique because I want to
Sure.
just kind of dive into your wisdom with working with people, right? The quote I believe you said, correct me if I'm wrong, was if you don't know the difference, what's the difference? Is that right?
Yeah. What's the difference if you don't know the difference? How can you assert any knowledge of what the difference is if you haven't experienced and walked down the path of understanding? You go, oh, now I can compare and contrast to what I was doing before.
Now, I would say in this generation, like the last 2 years, this is different, but in 20 years of working in a rehab style space using exercise to help people, I would seldom find people that are ready to hear proactive strategies to really improve themselves and fix problems unless they've had a problem. And that's often the case. So I'm just wondering with you, because you've got, I'm doing my exercise thing for 20. You got 44 years in this particular landscape. Do you have people that proactively approach you and like, hey, listen, I don't have any problems, but I want to be on top of this? Are they ready to hear that information? Or are you generally a problem solver when it comes to this kind of technique stuff that we're talking about today?
It's a hybrid, Brandon. I mean, I have people who come to me and they know what I do, so they do come to me to get a kick in the butt.
Right.
They do know that there's some limitations to what they're doing. And so, and I am a problem solver, and I'm not a browbeat, like whip you into shape and get mad at you or kind of chastise you. But I say matter of factly, these are the effective changes that are going to bring you from step A to B to C and onward. And if you don't apply yourself, you're not going to really get the measured results you're after. So I have, again, like I have a very comprehensive step-by-step program that is flexible. It's a living and breathing entity. I'm not like, okay, we all go from step A to B to C, because I get to know each individual, listening to where they come from culturally, or where they come from geographically, where they come from musically, where they come from in the timeline of humanity. If they're born in the 90s, they got a different experience than a guy who's born in the 50s. And so I take all that into account. I got big ears and listen to people. I'm very into, and I remember, I've got a like sort of a categorical memory for stuff. Like, in fact, this one kid who came back to me, he came at the very beginning of the pandemic, and he had a problem here. And he was like really concerned about it. Pandemic hit. All his gigs got knocked off. He was supposed to go to South by Southwest. He was supposed to go to Nashville and do a recording. He had a couple of gigs and everything was gone. So he couldn't come back to me. He couldn't afford it. And I was shocked. I was like, oh man, okay, that was 2020. He came back to me like 2 weeks ago. Hey man, I've been watching you on the Instagram and I'm really following you and watching you. And I want to get like like some feedback. Can you help me out? Yeah, come on in. So he lives in Los Angeles. He comes in live. So I go like, yeah, you were the guy who had the thing with the forearm and the blah, blah, blah. He's like, how do you remember that? I just remember stuff like that. I'm very into kind of watching and listening to everybody's story, just like what I did as a student with Freddie. He didn't write notes in a notebook. He wrote it in your drum book, in the Buddy Rich book, in the Burns and Malin book. You were on your own to retain the essence of what you were working on. So I had like this, I don't know if it's like one of those kind of focused memories where you remember everything, but I was very detailed. Everything was categorized in my head. And I had it like on a library shelf in my head, and I could go, yeah, that was that one. And years later, when I would come back to things, I still had that. But the point is when you're working with people and you're trying to progress, you present it in a matter-of-fact fashion. And I also try to hold everybody accountable in this way. I say, send me a video. All right? We do it easy. Have a YouTube channel. I don't want any WeTransfers, Dropbox. I don't need that. I don't want a big file on my email. Upload it where it's unlisted. And it's unlisted, send me a link. Don't make it like an epic 20-minute video or a 12-minute video. Give me the bullet points. And don't worry about being nervous, because everybody gets camera shy. Don't worry about perfecting. I just want to see how you're processing what you're processing, because it's important. You're coming to me to get a result. Do that. I don't, unless it's a 5-alarm fire, I won't really get back, but I will look, and then I categorically know when I see Joe or Jane or whoever, you know what I mean? I'll go like, oh yeah, when you were doing that thing, man, you're not letting that wrist release enough. Or you're kind of letting your elbow lead you up. You don't want your elbow to lead you up. You want to let the elbow be a byproduct of the lift. If you're lifting more from the back of your wrist, think of it like a marionette puppet, right? Those things are just, they're all hinges. You lift up and you let go. So you're trying to replicate a little bit of that in how you house the drumstick and deliver that stick to your cymbal or your toms. And like I said, not like a spaghetti noodle where you get like a little tippy-tappy, wimpy sound, getting a nice crack. Because if you know the pressure point, you know how to impact, like what I was talking about with the conga slap, you'll get a bap, and that's what you want. You want that coming right into it. You see how my hands are open? I'm just demonstrating as a posture, but when I come to the cymbal or the snare drum, it's bap, everything closes down, and I'm getting the impact that I want. If I deliver that very effectively, I'll get what I need out of that. And the other side of things that we didn't talk about is the choreographing of how you move, how you deliver rhythmically what's going on with an upstroke, whether it's even touching the pad or the drum or not, is a rhythmic value that you can draw into and make things dance and get what I call the flow, the fluidity of how things move. So going back again to like a sticking, if you're playing right, left, right, right, left, right, left, left, but you don't have a design of that and you're not aware of that, you're not really developing the true nature of dance of what you could put forward. And I always say, in terms of dance, two concepts that we could sort of draw into of our drumming: tap dance and ballet. Nice pirouettes and a lot of nice, interesting lifts and drops like Sammy Davis Jr. tapping out a ridiculous rhythm with Buddy Rich,
I love it. So if we segue slightly from this, because I love this, and you got so much information. I could see we could talk about a thing for the entire length of the show if we would. But
I'm doing this a long time, so there are a lot of things.
Of course. So let's go speed and endurance, right? So like you're talking about technique. The questions I hear so much about, and I'll say this from sports performance world, I've got a lot of like sports performance training stuff. But I'm wondering, because you get a lot of experience here. Someone comes in, you're dabbling into technique, right? There are two ends. Hey, I want to do this thing faster. Hey, I want to do this thing longer, but I'm getting tired.
Let's go speed. You can't play what you don't hear. So if you're talking about playing really fast, if you can't hear it fast, then it's not going to come out. It's not really going to be, a spoken element of your delivering, right? You're delivering sentence structure and attitudes and all that stuff. And if you don't hear it, you're not going to be able to really perform it. I can go back as a kid. I had pretty good chops. I had really fast singles when I was younger because I was obsessed with it. Now my singles are not as fast. But that being said, I have good control over them. I don't need the speed necessarily. I need the finesse. And along with the finesse, I need to be able to hear phrasings. So, the thing about just playing straight up singles, you don't really do just straight up singles where you're in one position. You'd have a molar move to outline the rhythmic value, or you have combinations of singles and doubles that can build up a greater value to the speed of what you're trying to do. Each tempo and the vibe or the characteristic rhythmically of the tune will dictate what you have access to. And so those things, when you're in a tune, let's say you're going like, do do da da didn't da 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 da, and you want to be able to go like do some fast 16th notes, you got to be able to hear it. If you don't hear it, it's not going to come out. So, the recommended dose, and this has been drawn into me when I was a kid and I didn't understand it. Now, as a guy who's a little bit older on this planet, you want to play fast, play slow. Learn to track what's going on. See every movement in your head of how things are orchestrated and continuously do that over and over, and it'll click. It's kind of like the sports mentality of like a high-tech skier going down the slalom and like visualizing continuously of how they're going through it. So they're reactive and they're just programming the brain. You do the same thing with our drumming, in terms of like the finesseful fast stuff. Now, if you're talking about stamina, that just comes from doing and playing. And most importantly, if you're not having a playing outlet, then you got to play music. You got to play to some tracks. That's not really delivering the full role of what we do because you're playing to pre-designed tracks. You're not interacting with people. Interacting with people draws upon a different sensibility. And so when you're playing, at least you can work on the stamina of playing like to I Keep Forgetting by Michael McDonald, that great one-handed 16th note pattern that Jeff Becker does so nice and fluidly. And you can use that at least as a model to, okay, that's my goal. If you can't reach the goal, you slow the track down and you work with it. You can kind of do some trickery. If you know the tune, and like I said before, you can't play what you don't hear. If you play something repetitively, even though it's a little slower, you're programming that you know every nuance of that tune. And I would bet to say, I don't have any science on this, but I would bet to say if you do that regularly, suddenly when you go to regular tempo, you're going to go like, oh yeah, I know this. That's how it works. Those kind of factors are built into knowing the tune, designing that performance, not just the 16th note pattern only, but becoming a role or a part of the music, becoming the little cog in the wheel, so to speak. And so, the stamina factor, it is a practiced value. If you don't practice, you're not going to be able to play like a jazz ride cymbal pattern at like 300 BPM. If you don't practice the one-handed 16th notes, you might not achieve the Jeff Becker roughly 96 or 95 BPMs or so. You can do other ways. You could do the push-pull. It's a little more efficient in terms of how it works. I can build up better speed with that, but I don't get the tonal quality I'm looking for. So if you want that certain tone and attitude, you got to just be patient and sit and do it slow. And in this, high-tech, fast-paced, I want it yesterday world, nothing changes with humanity. Practice, practice, practice. There's no shortcuts. There's no hacks. I can provide what I would consider shortcuts and hacks, so you don't have to go over here and then run over here. I can give you a more direct line to develop what you're looking for. But it still takes, hey, I got to sit with those things so I can reproduce what the feel is, get the reflex, understand how that moves, take the first set of mechanics and then build it into a calisthenic. So when I play the paradiddle, I go, oh yeah, paradiddle, right? Here's a factor of the paradiddle. When I play this, I have a couple of modes. I could sit inside my hand, which would be very effective if I was doing more of a funky thing on the hi-hat and the snare drum. But if I'm going for evaluating the rebound, I want that stick to just pop through my grip nicely, and I'll say that diddle is for free. It comes right back to me. I don't need to go. And then there's the value of the upstroke. 1 and a E, 3 and a E. If I don't have a good fluid upstroke, then my downstroke's going to be corrupted. If there's no elasticity to the lift, my drop's going to suffer, and I'm not going to get the value of what I need to make it come out easy. So while we know the paradiddle is right, left, 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 how you move with that is going to produce the fluidity that you're after. Understanding the upstrokes and downstrokes mentality, the circular nature of what we do, or the orbit effect of what we do, that what comes up must come down. Well, if that downstroke is kind of crappy, it means that I didn't really get a good fluid upstroke to add to that. And even in the faster position of movement, it still exists. Time and space being relative, it's just down here. I can't open it up to here. That would be working against myself.
I think even your demonstration, perhaps accidentally shows something else, right? Because you're ripping all these paradiddles between 180, 200 BPM, whatever it may be, but you're talking over top of it. And I think for any student, in my opinion, that demonstrates that the technique, the patterns, the dance, the flow, it's become reflexive and autonomous. So you're able to communicate over top of it. Sure, there might be a rudiment or two that is more uncomfortable because you have only done the Rademachew 100 times instead of 100,000 times, but you should be able to do some of the basics as you just did. And I think that's a great assessment, because if you can't talk over top of it to some degree, then it's not really ingrained. So then we need to put the time in.
Right, exactly. And, then there are the tangled stickings of doing these different things. I see some people go like, why do I even need to do rudiments? Well, so if I can just go into a little bit of my background, I've been practicing yoga for about longer than 25 years, but really effectively for about 24 years, regularly. And in my first 12 or 14 years, honestly, I was on a mat about 300 days a year. So I took it serious. I would go once a week, but changing the habit, what we were talking about earlier, was that I don't want to just wait to go to the yoga studio. I need to watch and observe what's going on with the few different teachers I went to, and then start to assess, like, what are my better routines for me, and then get down and dirty and do it.
Yeah.
Nothing to it but to do it. So in terms of the shift and change of what you do, it takes that element of just redesigning your reflexes to do what you're doing. So you can do tangled rudiments, and they'll be valuable. They'll give you maybe a little bit more inside the hand pliability. They all lead to the same thing, better control. So what I was going to say about the yoga, while I practice yoga, I don't walk out onto the street corner when I'm crossing the street and go into a downward dog because I can. I do yoga here, so I have a little bit more of a peaceful nature to my general persona. And I've got 2 young kids. I ain't no young dad. I got a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. And so patience and my intensive teaching draw a lot out of me. How do I plug back in and get energy and kind of serve myself up? Practice yoga. And I do that regularly for many years. And so that's the plug-in. There's also, in terms of those philosophies of the balance and the pressure point and how you operate in yoga postures, and the inner observation that you draw upon is the same thing that I would supply in terms of how you build up drum technique.
I think there definitely needs to be a testimony for you just having natural good habits, both the combination of the technique and exercising regularly, because you regarded your teaching experience, so we can surmise that you have a few years of experience under your belt, but you move really well and you have a lot of vitality, a lot of energy, you're extremely sharp. So, truthfully, all the things you're doing has summated into this really healthy experience where you are a pretty darn healthy, not spring chicken dad, I believe you said in your own words.
Yeah, I ain't no spring chicken, man. I'm 66, dude.
Yeah, but you're doing great. You're moving so well for 66, though, which is my point.
Well, so what I want to bring forward is that I can be the example of what one could aspire to do in terms of the mechanics of what they do drumistically. If you have the right guidance, you can shift and change things and not have to, get into workarounds that may not be exactly where you want to be with your hands or your feet. And you can actualize what it is. Again, there's no quick fix to that. It really takes a regular dedication. But I always see as this little entity of drumsticks and the drum set as a major gift from the universe, to be able to sit in that headspace of development and creativity and introspection of what we can do musically, and take that responsibility and say, like, yeah, I want to refine it. Even if you're the meat and potatoes drummer, you could still add a value to how you drop your body weight into producing a nice pop of the beater ball off the head to get a big fat sound out of the bass drum, and utilizing that understanding of dropping that weight in time, so that when you are using your body weight, if you're just dropping to the right and to the left, if you kind of skip out of pace there, you'll know it. It's an inner recognition of that for time, just as much as what I talk about with the choreography of movement. If you're slightly out on your upstroke and downstroke, you'll feel it. It's recognizable. You still have to sit with your metronome a little bit to produce a really good inner understanding of subdivision and how that works. But at the end of the day, those body mechanics can bolster your inner experience of how you present time on the instrument.
Bruce, I got one more question for you, and it might be the great one to kind of put a pin in today, because we've been talking for a while, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
No worries, yeah.
I think you talked about studying with Freddie Gruber, and I see old videos of the Moeller technique being demonstrated. And a lot of the teachings shows this extremely demonstrative elbow position where the elbow is doing a tremendous amount of motion. And in my observation, you see a lot of people as mature adults trying to exhibit that same elbow motion while they're going fast. I was wondering if you had an opinion on that, considering economy of motion and trying to save energy as much as possible.
I've been working on this. I don't have it yet set up, but I'm working on a button on my little keyboard here that when I push it, it'll go with a big red X. This is absolutely unnecessary and really a disservice to what that motion is about. Doing something like this is not going to get you any efficiency. even on the basic things of like this. That's not what it is, man. You take a little imaginary marionette string to the back of your wrist and you lift up and you drop. And as you're lifting up, the weight of the stick, if your hand is amenable and has the pliability to let the stick swing, the stick will swing naturally through that upstroke space. Do I need to pass beyond 90? No, because if I'm beyond 90 degrees, gravity's here, and I would need to throw the stick back. I can drop right into it and get a nice, buoyant, big, fat tone, provided I have the infrastructure of my hand ready to accept the impact, draw into it. Do you see that stick pop off the surface? So the biggest stroke I need would be maybe something like that. Okay, if I want to play like the stadium, like my good friend Mark Schulman when he was playing with Pink and Cher and Foreigner and blah, blah, blah. He came to me at various periods to study, and we would talk about that. He wanted to have that. So there was that, I got to play to the guy in the 80th row, and I got to spin my sticks and drop into that. But he had a mindfulness to know how to drop into it effectively. So it was a little bit more of the dramatic flair for the show. But for the fact of ergonomics and movement and motion, it's an unnecessary point. And when I see people do that, subtly my head would blow up a little bit. But I'm here to spread the good news of what you can do. I don't want to have to go through every lane of the internet and go like, oh, don't do that. That's not my role. When people come to me, they know what I'm about and they can get my straight up insights to what that is. And I'm not ever like dismissing, but I can go like, it's somewhat misguided. If you're bouncing the stick like this and you're going over 90, again, you're not working with the natural value of weight and keeping it in front and just bouncing naturally. It's logical. It's ridiculous when I see that stuff on it goes beyond 90. You're pushing it back. I don't want to push. I want to be able to let go effectively and move that stick in a nice fashion. And if I just say, about a few guys that I know that were Freddie Gruber guys specifically, this is say Dave Weckl. No better of a great example of great flow and great ergonomic movement of how he does what he does, and that's testimony to what he had grabbed from Freddie. So if you understand those principles, you can get that kind of fluidity. You can add it to your jazz playing. You can add it to your rock playing, your R&B, whatever you want to do. It's all the body. You don't have the body kind of toned up and ready to go. Doesn't matter what musical style you're playing. Doesn't matter. Speed metal guys, they got to be super efficient. You can't play that fast and be wildly off the cymbal and the snare drum. You're working against everything. So anyway, that's how I would kind of cap that off with the molar. And great question, actually, because that does become something that I'm very passionate about, kind of moving away from these. There's so many videos out there that are kind of, not very well guided. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, whoa, I don't want to lift with my elbow, man. I want to just, this hinge, man. Remember I said at the beginning, this hinge, just let it lift and let it drop,
Way too much energy.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly, dude. And because what you do is kind of redirecting things to get people back in the flow of movement, whether they're sports figures or just the regular Joe who needed to be rehabbed because he had some crappy injury,
Yeah, Bruce, I have to say this was extremely enlightening. I love the pace and all the energy you have. Thank you so much for your time and sharing this wisdom. This was incredible.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you for doing your videos because you have some nice little talking points that you put forward. I've been watching you for a while, and just a backstory. You had reached out to me in September of last year regarding another issue, but it's funny because I had every intention of responding, and when you said, when we reconnected, you said, yeah, I reached out to you. I looked at my text and I went, damn, I did have that. So I didn't delete it. There was no like, oh, I'm going to delete this. It's still on here.
Screw this guy.
It said, probably Brandon Green, and I was like, who's this guy, And so anyway, now we've connected and appreciate the opportunity to have a great conversation with you and carry on with what you do as well, brother.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Before we close out, where can people learn more about what you do?
You can go to brucebecker.com. You can go to Bruce Becker Drums at Instagram and watch some of my videos. I've got my YouTube channel, Bruce Becker Drums. You've got Facebook page of Bruce Becker. I think it's Bruce Becker Drums as well. You got my regular Facebook page. I'm on the usual suspects. If you just look Bruce Becker and drums, you're going to find me. I did so many things for Drumeo. I've been up there, I think, half a dozen times. I created their very successful Drum Technique Made Easy course. I did a bunch of live streaming and contributed a bunch of stuff to Drum Channel many years ago. I have my book behind me, my Ultimate Guide. Whoops, wrong way. Ultimate Guide to Syncopation, my Puzzles, Rhymes, and Riddles. I've got a new book that's going to be coming out a little later this year, and on and on and on. So you just put Bruce Becker drums, you're going to find me somewhere. you know.
Amazing. Well, Bruce, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do. Congratulations on being such a healthy individual and an energetic father. And I really appreciate you, man. Thank you so much for your great time today.
Right on. Thank you, Brandon.